Morning.
Morning.
Nice to see such a full hall for this important day. I'm going to talk this morning a little bit about the celebration of Ohigan, which means the equinox, and the kind of practices that we do. Probably talk a little bit longer than I normally do at the beginning of a ceremony. The purpose of that is both so we have an understanding of what it is that we're doing together today, and then how what we're doing together today can help orient our lives. So the purpose of a ceremony is there within the ceremony, but also the ceremony is a kind of microcosm of these other layers. You could kind of think circles that go out and out and out. So when you practice a particular ceremony, then it's about what happens in that ceremony, but what happens in that ceremony also is relevant on all these different levels. And that's part of really the effort, the work, the joy, the frustration of a religious life or a life that's involved with spiritual practice of some kind, is it can be inspiring, but also it does demand something of us. It's not only to kind of be reassured, although being reassured is good, but then in that reassurance, how do I carry forward what it is that is being offered? And within Buddhism, we don't have too much of a worry about whether people are Buddhists or not. I always feel important to say that. So sometimes people feel like, well, can I be part of this ceremony if I'm not Buddhist? Yes. There's no hard edge on the thing, and participation to the extent that you feel comfortable or you feel like you want to is welcome. When you don't want to, that's also fine to just be present. So I think most people know the equinox as the time that the night and day share the same amount of time. It's the point of equilibrium or equalness between night and day. And so we passed through that gate. I believe it was past last Thursday. And in Japan, the equinox is an important time where people go and they visit their ancestors, and they do that by visiting the grave, their family grave, and making offerings at the temple. And for people in that environment, a connection back to their ancestral roots is really a primary part of their spiritual life. Here at Buddha Eye, we focus a little bit less on the human ancestors and a little bit more on our ancestral life in regards to the natural world, kind of with a broad stroke also natural world. That this point of the equinox is this place of balance. But I want to point something out about that that's really important for this ceremony. There's actually always balance. Right? The balance is not what happens at the equinox. The equinox is the midpoint of that continual expression of balance. So if you think about it in a kind of linear way, which isn't my favorite, but it's easier to grasp, we have the solstice in the summer and in the winter. In the summer, that's when the light is the longest and the night is the shortest. So that'd be the solstice in the summertime. We have the winter solstice when the dark is the longest and the light is the littlest. And if you're given to seasonal affective disorder, that's probably when you're in a hole somewhere. It's pretty hard on people in Oregon especially. But if we think about those two places as being the extreme, then the equinoxes lie in between that. So you can actually think of it a little bit circular, right? So here's the summer solstice, winter solstice, and then you have these places where the night and the day are the same. And that has to do, just because I used to be a geography teacher, I will remind you of this. The Earth's tilt. The Earth's not actually doing this exactly. The Earth's like this and it's going around the sun. And so the relationship of the slant of the Earth in relationship to the sun is changing all the time, and that's what gives us these seasons. So actually throughout that there's always a balance, but at that equal point there's something that is symbolized. So what I mean by symbolized here is that there's something which we can't really grasp. The dynamic balance of light and dark is not something we can't grab it. That's what it means for it to be dynamic. Right? And its dynamic balance, its ungraspability means that we need some symbol to be able to appreciate that balance that's going on all the time. We need some way to appreciate that balance. So the equinox becomes a point in time where we can accept it as a kind of symbol. It could be any day, actually. You could say everything's perfectly balanced in the system on any day. But we'll choose the equinox because it becomes an important turning point for us. And why are those symbols necessary? They're necessary because it is important for us to learn to foster gratitude and humility in the face of life that is way beyond our ability to just map out in our head. Actually, to harmonize with being, this kind of gratitude and humility is fundamental. Without the gratitude and humility, there really is no doorway to harmonizing with that balance of being, here expressed as dark and light. So in Buddhism, we say that everything is completely interrelated. You might have heard the term before, interbeing, which is a word that was coined by the great Zen teacher Thich Nhat Hanh. It's really a great word, interbeing. That usually we think I be, I am, you are, you am. That's all kind of, so we're actually inter-are. That there is, sometimes a like fancy philosophical word would be like intersubjectivity. Like your experience of living and my experience of living are completely bound up in each other. So the harmony that we're trying to enact, the harmonizing that we are endeavoring to bring about with our life is based in this interbeing. And that's why everything is always balanced, because it always is inter-are. We always are in that inter-arness, which means there's always a balance, although sometimes it rocks pretty hard to the left or to the right. Right? And we get confused by that. When it rocks pretty hard one direction, we think, oh, I better rip it back the other direction. And then it's like when you're learning to ride a bicycle, you know. So you're afraid, your body tightens up, you fall over, you overcorrect, you fall over the other direction. So since that's our habit, this interpenetrated living that we're part of all the time, it's important for us to respect that there is this balance point, and then to learn to enact the gratitude and the humility of being able to live that out. It's not only the balance of forces. That's the way oftentimes we think about this kind of balance, that there's forces in the world, and these forces are in equilibrium, then everything goes well. And when the forces are out of equilibrium, it doesn't go well. Although that's true, Buddhism would say even when things aren't going well, there is a more fundamental balance. That the forces, in fact, will be out of balance sometimes, or they will be out of an equilibrium, and that's what life is. So that might be all a little bit heady, but it's kind of a starting point for thinking about why this particular day is important. That celebration of balance, that celebration of interbeing, and then a chance to remind ourselves that the gratitude and humility that is necessary for this harmonizing can be enacted. That's not just something we might have. You know, I don't just have gratitude or have humility. That's actually a practice of that. That's something I bring myself to again and again. Now, practice and forcing are different things. So I don't mean to say we just force ourselves to have gratitude or force ourselves to have humility. Actually, it's impossible. Those two practices can't be enacted through force. But we can turn our attention in a way that allows us to explore what that's about. What am I grateful for? And ask ourselves that question. Being in this valley is just sort of unbelievable. Like, I think about that every day. Just walking, my house is just a couple doors up on this side, and walking down to the temple. And there's phone lines, which I kind of like the phone lines actually, and everything. But you know, it's like, whew. What wells up in us? What discipline do we have of staying with that, knowing about how lucky I am to be at this place at this time? That's what I mean by practice. So I'm going to go heady here again for a couple minutes. I apologize for those of you who aren't oriented this way so much, but I think it is important to talk a little bit about where we sit in terms of our general place within the history of how humans think about who we are and what we're doing, particularly in the industrialized West. So whether you were born here, grew up here, or from another place, grew up in different cultural environments, linguistic environments, we're all marked by this to some extent. Those of us who were born in a dominant cultural paradigm within United States culture and grew up in that, you are definitely deeply marked by this, right? This particular type of perspective. And it's interesting to me that this perspective, I'm going to talk about it as a single perspective, although it shows up as a dichotomy in the public discourse. And that is between a monotheistic creator God and a mechanical universe. So it's died down a little bit, but there was a good good decade where those people will be yelling at each other on YouTube and stuff. And I think that's all died down a little bit. It's not that interesting. Well, it's a decade interesting maybe to have these public discussions about it. But I want to point something out about this. So if we, coming from a background in which a creator God is very important to most people or many people in their religious or spiritual life or their conception of things, that is an underlying current of the way that we conceptualize things. Even if you are not a person of faith within, say, Christianity or Islam or Judaism, even if you're not, you're marked by the mindset of that tradition. So just to lean into that a little bit, for example, to be in a tradition where there is a creator and a lawgiver, and the laws don't change, what does that sound like? Sounds a lot like science, doesn't it? That you could investigate the laws and they wouldn't change, they would always be the same, and you would know your place in the world through a process of that kind of investigation of unchanging laws. And the personhood of God or the personhood of the Creator becomes de-emphasized, and the law becomes emphasized, that there is a way. So if you're interested in this kind of study, there's a really amazing scholar named Charles Taylor. He wrote a very influential book called The Secular Age. It's about that thick. So if you're thinking like you're kind of bored these days, I highly recommend that book. It traces this process out. But one of the really, I think, revolutionary things that this philosophy is Canadian philosopher, so the book might be a little more expensive now. But that he traces is the way in which this particular mindset of a single creator God creates the conditions for the Enlightenment and the idea that we could kind of figure out how things are. And that mapping of how things are is how we understand truth. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is not because I think that either, or this perspective, which has these kind of two sides, necessarily brings us to a disregard for the world. particularly the natural world as a kind of blanket phrase. But we have definitely seen that it has led in Western industrialized countries to a kind of disregard. I'm not saying it necessarily does, but we have seen that it does. A kind of disenchantment is a term that you often hear. A secularized way of seeing the world, and really a kind of dropping of the sacred. And what I want to bring up about this particular mindset, it has created a kind of domain. That the authority of that way of thinking about things has become so strong that we live in the domain of that mindset. And that domain has some impossibilities. It does cut us off from some parts of the ways that we might understand who we are and what this life and this universe is about. One of the places that becomes difficult in that perspective, that domain, is the personhood of various beings. Oftentimes we think a person as just being about humans, but in this Buddhist way of thinking, we don't limit personhood just to human beings. We use the term being all the time. We say all manner of beings, the myriad beings. Sometimes you hear 10,000 beings. You hear all this beings. That's not just humans. And it's not just animate objects. And it's not just material beings either. So in Buddhism, when we talk about personhood, there's a real important shift in which we're not trying to just understand the mechanism of the natural world, but we're trying to meet the personhood of being. That there are all manner of beings, material, immaterial, subtle. And that all of those beings are an important part of living. And when we can't see the personhood, all manner of beings become invisible to us. They get reduced to a mechanism in the clock. And they're taken for granted and they begin to recede. We might be able to still appreciate beauty in some forms, but our soul or our deeper heart gets cut off from our being, really. And so it's here where this term that's very difficult for many moderns comes in. The term is spirit. In the ceremony today, you'll hear about spirits, you'll hear about devas, you'll hear about dharma protecting deities, persons or beings that are not limited to a material body. I would say that these beings are still corporeal. Okay? That's kind of a cool word, corporeal. Which usually, like just look up in the dictionary, it will say things like having a material body. That's what corporeal means. But actually it just means having a body. Why do you think having a body has to be material? What's the mindset that wants to reduce everything about embodiment to something that could be measured in a kind of material way? This is the gateway that can be opened up. It's not hard to open it up, but it can't be opened up with force. The reason that this is important, that we start talking about spirits, we talk about devas, we talk about these beings, these embodiments that are not simply limited to material embodiments, is because explanation in the end won't do. Being able to explain the mechanism of the clockwork or the theology of transcendence won't do. Actually, we have to meet. We have to actually harmonize. We have to bring about the humility and the gratitude and the dedication to the harmonizing. And the actual meeting is not about a dominion. You see the way that a dominion kind of claims the space, and then it interprets the experiences inside of that domain according to whatever the power structure of that is. When you really meet something, that's not there. You actually have to shed that to be able to encounter. You have to shed the idea that you're going to define the space within which the meeting is happening. That can be very disorienting, by the way. If you have the good fortune of being in a partnership with another human being, that's a really good place to learn about that. Like if you're really going to respect somebody, if you're really going to meet them, if you've already created the terrain on which the two of you are going to stand and discuss something, how well does that work? It doesn't, right? Because the person knows right away, you're not meeting me. You're just trying to put me in your box of understanding of how this is supposed to be. And then you're going to pretend like you're really talking with me, but basically you're just trying to kind of, tilt the ground to get me in the place that you want me to go. So a real meeting, this is why personhood is so important for us to acknowledge and to attempt to meet these persons, because that's the place in which the humility is possible. There's a thing that happens when people are doing meditation, Buddhist practice in general, or different kinds of wisdom tradition practices, is the teaching of interdependence starts to mean something like reducing everything to myself. Like, oh, I feel one with everything. Oh, the sky, it's so beautiful. I'm walking down from the temple. It's so beautiful. I know it's so important to be right here. And it all becomes about my experience. And it's all interpreted as like, oh, how wonderful it is because I can be calm enough and I'm in the situation where the beauty is reflected in everything through my equanimity, which is groovy. I mean, go for that. I highly recommend it. And then see the way in which that's kind of a domain. It's kind of a forceful position, a kind of claiming the ground. But there's something else which is much more like when you're completely awed by a situation. You know the term awe and awful, right? But we should remember that those words are related to each other. That to be in awe does not always feel comfortable. Right? In fact, it's challenging. And that's what I mean by the humility that's necessary. Of course, we try to make a beautiful ceremony. We try to bring our best heart forward. We try to meet these things with grace and tenderness. But there's also the truth in which the forces of being that are way beyond our grasp, that's not just where they live. They don't just play by those rules. Although usually they're willing to meet us there. So, as I said earlier, there's a practice of this. There's a practice of realizing, okay, I kind of see the world in this slightly mechanical way. Even if I have a deep appreciation for the natural world, I might have a little bit of that way of thinking about everything. So the first part of the practice here in the Equinox is just to remember that this world is alive. The Eco-Dharma group has been reading a book, which I'm very interested in. I haven't read it yet, Gaia. Is that what it's called, Gaia? Becoming Earth, yeah. And the idea that the I don't even say idea, the understanding, the way of thinking about the whole Earth as a living body, which kind of seems no duh, but we don't do that, right? And so that place in which we say, we take a moment to say, how do I shed that? How do I shed? Not that perspective is never useful. That kind of reducing things to a material place that's measurable in a particular way, et cetera, that has given us many great things. I would say, like, probably 3/4 of us wouldn't be here if that was not true. We'd be dead. Because the kind of science that has produced the kind of medicine that could save us in different situations, for example. So I'm not saying that that's all bad, but saying, what's this other piece that we tend to drop out because this other one is so powerful? So that would be kind of the first step. And then to consider what it means to meet a person, to meet a being, to meet various beings that are really alive. Now, some people are more visionary. So I know some people in this hall see spirits. That's great. But for those of you who that's not something, that's not a deficiency. Having a visionary experience of spirits is not the point. The point is the meeting of the person, which for most people, most of the time, will not be a vision of a personification. It will be the thing itself, or the way that the thing is presenting itself. It contains its whole luminous heart. A blade of grass doesn't need to be a fairy to show you its total luminosity, although it may also show up as a fairy. I'm not denying that side, but people get caught up in that. They think like, oh, if I'm going to make an offering to, or I'm going to show my gratitude towards this personhood of things, that I have to have those kind of visionary experiences. And I'd say it's really not the case. That's one thing I love about the Japanese spiritual constitution, that the spirit body and the material body are never considered two. That's part of the reason that Japanese aesthetics is so badass, is because they don't lift off of that. They don't say, I'm going to go to some other thing to express the truth of this tree. This tree is expressing the truth of this tree. The total spiritual aliveness of this tree is personified completely as a tree. And if you look closely, oftentimes then you see a little statue, maybe tucked up in the moss, or a special character that's written, or a rope that's woven from rice straw that is hung around the tree, which is a mark of a sacred place. So we don't have so many of those kind of customs here. So we're left with having to really lean in, not just to rely on the environment that has been there. So whether you're a person who tends towards a more visionary or not, that's not the point. Dropping some of the domain of the rational, or the kind of ordered universe of the central authority of God, and thinking about all of these beings that are just everywhere all the time, and then saying, how will I respect them? I'm not going to wait for some special experience or something. I'm going to try to offer to them directly. We'll have a ritual together today to do that. It's very simple. But the purpose, again, coming back to the beginning, is to help foster a quiet orientation. By here, quiet, I mean hidden. I mean not something that you put out there as being, I'm a person who meets the world in its personhood. But actually, how do you meet? Right? What's your regard? I'm using that term all the time these days. What's your regard? How do you regard these things? How do you treasure them? How do you respect and care for? That is an orientation. We can express that orientation in all kinds of ways. But it's not just an experience we have, it's a thing we do. How would you join with these persons through your work to care for being? That's a question I would ask you. Whatever your work is, how would you join with them? What would it mean to join? And that will be your practice moving on from the ceremony. How can I see? To see something is to respect it. You hear that a lot, people in, I think, like generation of my kids who are like in their late 20s and early 30s now. We didn't really use that terminology very much, but to be seen. You say, I feel seen or I don't feel seen. Mm-hmm. So what does it mean to be seen? It means to be respected, right? As a person, not as a facet of my understanding of the world, right? But as a being. So joining through work, respecting through seeing the personhood, working on the regard, and then I would say the trick to all this is tenderness. When you harden, it disappears. Whether that hardening is hardening into a view, or that hardening is the hardening of fear, that it cuts us off and the eyes that can see in this way close. So that's the work that we do in the ceremony, but then also branching out into our lives beyond the ceremony. So the ceremony today will look surprise, like most ceremonies that you've been to at Budai Temple, if you've been here before for ceremonies. But I do want to point something out about it that's different. There's only a couple ceremonies that we perform in this way where there's an altar on this side. So in a couple minutes here, I'll leave and change my robes, and there'll be some preparations made, and then we'll have the ritual together. But this formulation is really important. And you see behind me on the altar, right in front of the Buddha, there's a mirror. People oftentimes ask me what that mirror means, and I don't answer. It's a mirror. So that mirror there on the altar and this altar here, they are not separate at all. There's a mirroring here. And this altar then represents the personhood of the world. And this altar represents the personhood of awakening. Those of you who are studying the Lotus Sutra right now, the Buddha's illumination of the Eastern Quarter, or the Buddha's illumination of all worlds, that is present here in this arrangement that we're enacting with the ritual. So at the beginning of the ritual, there'll be an entrance, incense offering, prostrations. We'll chant a sutra. The two sutras that we're chanting this morning are the ones that we do on Sundays. So the first is the Makahanya Haramita Shingyo in English is Heart of Great Perfect Wisdom Sutra. And then we're making those offerings to the Buddha. Then there'll be a bell, and the direction will change. So in the change of the direction, then we're facing this direction, and then we'll be honoring and venerating the earth spirits and various spirits that nurture and protect this temple. And so that happens this direction. And there's a bunch of things that happen inside of that. Towards the end of the chanting, when we're faced this direction, everyone will be invited to come forward and make an incense offering. So there are two small wooden boxes that have charcoals in them, and then there's some chips of fragrant wood. So the way you make the offering is you pick up a little pinch of that fragrant wood, and you touch it here to your forehead. This is like a place of honoring. This is kind of the most important part of your body, we would say in Buddhism. So you touch it here to bring that into your awareness, and then put the fragrant wood on the charcoals, and then you can make a bow. And people come out this way to make the offerings and then come back in like this. We chose to do the ceremony here at this altar today rather than outside at the spirits altar because we were concerned about the rain. And this made it easier to do. So there'll also be, after the ceremony, there'll be, that altar's also been prepared. You can go out individually if you like to make offerings there at the spirits altar that we established under the fig tree a few years ago. So I think that's all it is that in terms of the instruction for the ceremony. As I would just end by saying, rituals are not meant to mean something that you could pull out of the ritual. They're just meant to be enacted, and then to live out the truth of that ritual is how it becomes meaningful. Although the thing is full of symbols, so if there's something that kind of catches your attention, pay attention to it. It'll be part of the thing that pulls you inside out, if you're lucky.